Chapter 2, Fixin' to Die. I don't mind dying, just hate to leave my children crying. Book of White. Late at night, Dulles is a lonely place to fly into, especially in January with a couple of inches of frozen slush on the ground. The main terminal rises out of a concrete lake like a set from a Star Trek episode. Night turns the window walls glossy black as obsidian. I caught a glimpse of my reflection framed in tar and winced. I looked burnt down and beat to the wide, a refugee from the Manson cult. All I had to wear were dirty jeans and a last resort t-shirt I'd gotten from Marco. 2 taxis turned me down before one agreed to take me to Capitol Hill. The driver, whom I privately dubbed Igor Muhammad because I wasn't sure which ethnicity went with his Eastern Mediterranean looks, grunted in answer to all my questions. I gave up finally. Silence seemed more companionable than pig talk. The heater didn't heat, and I started to shiver so hard my teeth were knocking. It was a long, cold ride to the city, punctuated by bleak scenes of scarecrow tree stubble, alternating with views of concrete retaining walls. I felt like Bartleby looking out at Wall Street in one of his reveries. I, too, preferred not to. Then one of those damn Talking Head songs started beating a tattoo in my skull. I tried to get a rhythm going with my chattering teeth and gave it up. My career as an academic talking head had been in cold storage for the last 2 years, while I had taken a so-called sabbatical to celebrate and mourn being tenured and divorced. Although which was more to be celebrated and which mourned, I wasn't sure. Robert Johnson, who couldn't make his own fortune, had made mine. The book I'd written on the place of his songs in the Southern literary tradition had managed to find an audience. First, there were some favorable reviews in some trendy academic journals. Then the New Yorker and the New York Times Book Review had praised the book as readable and accessible. Not exactly virtues in academia these days, but more or less what I'd aimed at. It had even made me a little money. A year later, at the 10-year witch trial, I was one of the accused in the annual procession to the scaffold. Would I go up and smoke? Would I find sanctuary as a colleague? The English department hemmed and hawed over my case, its reigning Olympians being a crew of postmodernists with little love for my subject. Van Dillingham himself was the local Duke of Foucault. What saved me, I think, was that during that month I was invited to New Haven to give a talk on the Faulkner chapter, Joe Christmas, a hellhound on his trail. I was told that my talk made a useful impression on one of the greats at Yale, and that in turn won over the department, bar the Van Dillingham faction, which after much furor caved in. It had been a close-run thing, but Jack Schock had made it down the pipe. Although we hadn't lived together for some time, Donna had formally bailed out of our marriage during the nip and tuck phase of deliberations. She was pretty bitter about my success. She'd taken to sleeping with my best friend and chief rival for tenure, Bill Smalls, the shoo-in from Harvard and that year's postmodernist Great White Hope. His book Shakespeare by Lacan was nihilistic, opaque, and very clever. Bill himself claimed that he had out-Van Dillinghammed Van Dillingham, but in the end Robert Johnson, luckless and demon-haunted, had done for me what Lacan couldn't do for Bill. The department had hung, drawn, and quartered him, and given me an office with a window. I had lost my home, my wife, my best friend, and in return I had a job in perpetuity, impersonating a college professor in the company of men and women who wrote and talked in dead earnest about ideas that were to me a parody of thought about a parody of life. I decided to make a run for it. As far as I knew, I wasn't coming back. My sabbatical led me to the Lesser Antilles. I sold my car and bought an old Cal 20, which 3 months later I hung on a reef in a storm off Bouquet in the Grenadines. I sold the boat for salvage and took the money to Belize, where I met a girl and then moved on. It went on like that for a while. I'd gotten a second year of unpaid leave by claiming more or less disingenuously to be working on a book on Marquez. What I was working on was learning Spanish from a Costa Rican surfer girl. That hadn't worked out either. All that I'd found in my travels had been a little bit of oblivion. Different countries, different situations, and now and again, different women. Katie from Panakel being the last and not the least. In almost 2 years, I'd met no one that I knew from the States. The only person I'd even written to, other than the letter requesting leave, had been Sam. Igor Mohammed drove us across the Memorial Bridge into the city and turned up Independence Avenue. We drove by some of the bars I've been sloshed in underage, overage, and in between. The Tune Inn, with its wall of stuffed animal heads and blue-collar clientele, had been my favorite. In the 80s, like everything, it had been yuppified. "Turn here," I said. We turned down the General Street and drove by Moynihan's house with its wall of plates painted by Picasso and residence of the General's least favorite senator. "That's the one," I said, pointing to a Georgian house with a rock facade. I could tell that Igor Mohammed, God bless his cynical heart, couldn't believe that someone who looked like me would be welcome, let alone reside in that house. Welcome? I'd never felt that. Lived there. I had for more years than I had any place else. It took a long time for my knocking on the door to get answered, and I stood there shivering in my t-shirt and ragged jeans under Igor Mohammed's doubtful but proprietary gaze. He needn't have worried. I had no place to run to now but this one. Finally, the outside light flickered on. Slowly the door opened. It was Sam. "Jack," she said. "Oh, Jack, you're here, you're here." She took me into her arms and hugged me the way people hug prodigal sons in the scenic moments of 30s movies. Sam was the kind of girl Capra would have matched with Gary Cooper or Jimmy Stewart. Straight up, not hung up. A face lit by a light within. To me, she had always been Cousin Sam, although she was no blood kin. Aunt Grace, my father's dead brother's wife, long dead herself to me, had borne her 10 months after Uncle Mike had died. "I'm stony, Sam," I said, looking at her. She got her purse and paid off Igor Mohammed, who, charmed by Sam's neon smile and big tip, brought my bag to the door before he drove off. We stood there a moment looking each other over. She was tall for a woman, maybe as tall as I. Her long hair, about as black as a crow's wing, and her eyes as blue as the waters of Atitlan. Not a great one for powder and paint. I was glad to see she still had a dusting of freckles across her nose, and also still glad she had a way of smiling whenever I looked at her. "You're so thin," she said. "I'm all right." "Your beard looks like a blackberry bramble." She took my hand, hers so white and mine so dark that I seemed altogether from a different race. "Is that really your skin, Jack?" "It's me. You get a lot of sun down south." She smiled at my feeble wit. "It's been 2 years, Jack." Then she hugged me again. She was crying now, and I quit trying not to hug her back. "I missed you." "Missed you too," I said. We stood there a while rocking, entwined. There was a long stretch of muffled sobs and whispers. Her hair smelled old-fashioned, like lilacs. Her face was buried in my chest, and it felt wet like a warm rain. Then I started to feel something else holding her and gently pushed her from me and looked her in the eye. "What's wrong with the old man?" "It's cancer, Jack." Cold stone dropped through my guts. "What kind?" "Liver." "Oh no." "It's metastasized." "No." "How long?" "About 3 months." "To live?" "No, that's how long I've known. He's dying." "How long?" I asked again. "Any time." She was crying. "He could go any time." Then she added, "He's suffering. I think he's hung on to see you." I couldn't think of anything to say. I could see the portrait of him at the foot of the staircase, where it faced one of my mother. It had been painted in Bavaria in the 40s, just after they were married and before I was born. A major then, he was dressed in olive drab with the yellow and red 8th Army patch on his shoulder. Before the surrender, the artist had made his living painting Nazi officers and the Third Reich's petty bureaucrats, and out of habit, he had Teutonized the old man's face, arching the nose, lightening the hair. But he'd certainly caught my father's characteristic look, the fearless eyes of a peregrine, something hooded and ruthless that you saw even when he sat at the head of the table carving the Sunday beef. Facing him was my mother, a plump, high-colored Dutch girl with laughing green eyes and a full mouth. It had been many years since I'd seen her face in life. I'd never really gotten over her death. Neither had my father. He drunk the pain to sleep every night with blended Scotch whiskey and sunk every year into an isolation that only Sam could draw him out from. I noticed that Sam was looking at the portrait too. Do you think it looks like him? To the life, I said. And your mom? Not so much. I barely remember my mom at all. I know, I said. Once again, she came into my arms. I felt her against me all along my body. This is just what I don't need, I was thinking. Christ, it's almost incest. Again, I pushed her away as softly as I could. Where is he? I asked. Upstairs, asleep. Shouldn't he be in a hospital? He came home from Walter Reed last week. They say there's nothing they can do for him, and he wants to die at home. Does he get something for the pain? Yes, she said. I give him that. Will he know me? Yes. She waited. He's been asking for you, Jack. I nodded. I felt empty of anything. I didn't even want to drink. I realized suddenly that the 12 hours I'd spent since I'd gotten on the plane in Guatemala City were the longest I'd gone without a drink or a cigarette since the boat wreck 15 months before. But I was alive, at least, and here. Let's go up, I said. We walked up the sweep of the curved staircase to the second floor bedrooms. He's in your room, she said. My room? He wanted to stay there, Jack. Why? Because it's quiet? I think he misses you, Jack. I thought about that. I had too long a knowledge of the old man lying in there to credit her sentimental reading of his motives. My estrangement from him was visceral. I'd never known his praise. Moral support wasn't his long suit either. His comment when I told him that Donna had moved out was typical. What are you going to do, Jack? Fall on your sword? We stood at the door to my bedroom. I looked at Sam, but she shook her head and stepped back. Slowly, I pushed the door open and went in. I heard the door pulled shut behind me. A small brass lamp on the nightstand lighted his face. For a while, I listened to the rhythm of his breathing. I drew closer. I couldn't remember ever looking at my father sleeping. I know I must have, maybe when I was a boy. Almost before I knew it, I'd reached my hand to his face and touched his cheek with the back of my fingers. He stirred but didn't wake. Even in the dim light, I could see the lines of his face. It made me think of a landscape glimpsed from a plane window over Arizona. The bones of his cheek and jaw were stretching the skin, the skull pushing through, foreshadowing. His face was inscrutable, even in the last ravages of embattled mortality. There was a Windsor chair. I sat beside him, my hand on the bed next to his head, all kinds of things going through my mind, some crazy, some sad. After a while, I must have slept because there was light at the window. Whether dawn or false dawn, I didn't know. I looked down at my father's face, and almost as if I'd willed it, his eyes opened. Jack, he said. Sam is... He tried to finish, but the pain froze him in mid-sentence. Dad, I said. That was all. I took his hand. Then slowly, as if he were drifting off to sleep, it went slack. My mind was empty of anything except a line from Hellhound on my trail. Got to keep moving, blues falling down like hail. Maybe there was a knack to living. Keep moving was about all I'd learned. Time passed. I didn't sleep again. I was looking past my father at the brown and blue incandescence of the dawn, and I remembered suddenly a story his brother had told me of the last time they had seen their mother's face. She was running away with a man who rented a room from my grandfather. Her daughters, my father's sisters, were waiting in an old Model T. My grandmother had decided to leave her sons, maybe because the boarder was frightened they'd beat him up someday when they grew up. Uncle Mike and Dad stood by the coal furnace with a coin each in their hands. My uncle, who was 6, had 50 cents. My father, who was 2, had a quarter. They never saw her again, living or dead. My father didn't talk about his past, the orphanage and the foster homes. And it struck me now that I would have liked to ask him about those hard years, for in some way they had made him the kind of man he was, living by a design known best to himself. I watched the day dawn gold vermilion, like coals in a wood fire, and remembered, sailor, take warning. I'd watched a lot of sunsets, but not many dawns the last couple of years. I heard stirrings in the house. Sam's bedroom was on the ground floor. The smell of coffee brewing, like a creek bottom turned by the plow, wafted upstairs. There was a knock at the front door, and then the remembered creak of its knurled pins and hinges, followed by muffled words and steps ascending the carpeted stairs. The door handle turned. I watched it moving in the slow-motion time of a man waking to something that he isn't sure isn't a dream. The woman who wheezed and shambled in was coal-black, tall, fat, and wore oversized glasses shaped like cat's eyes. The name on her tunic was Pearline, like the Sunhouse song. Behind her stood Sam in a tartan robe. "And how is the General?" Pearline asked. "Asleep," I said. Her eyes rested on me briefly. Then she stooped noisily beside my father's bed. She took his pulse, touched his cheek. She looked at me and then at Sam. "He's not asleep," she said. "He's passed." When I looked at Sam, her eyes were swimming, and then I knew that mine were swimming too. All the kin my father had left in the world, and that was Sam and I, stood beside him when they laid him down among the orchard of crosses in Robert E. Lee's peach orchard, a marble one now. Rags of snow lay strewn on the graves. The bugler was a red-headed Irishman named McConaughey, who looked too young to know taps, let alone play it. I flinched when they fired the guns and Sam took my hand. Holding on to each other, we tottered towards the car. The earth seemed as shaky as a boat on rolling seas. The whole way home, Sam cried in my arms in the back of the rented black Lincoln. She had loved my old man, and it seemed a pity that a son whom he probably would not have chosen from a lineup of plausible applicants for the position was the last of his name and blood on this earth.